Did you know that at its peak, the British Empire controlled nearly 25% of the world's land and population? That means 1 in 4 people on Earth lived under British rule. But here's the thing, it wasn't all glory and victory. The British Empire's rise and fall left a legacy that still shapes the world today. Want to know how a small island nation ended up running the largest empire in history, and what happened when it all came crashing down? Hey, if you've ever wondered how the British Empire went from being a small, struggling island to a global superpower and how it eventually unraveled, this video's for you. We're diving into the fascinating history of one of the most influential empires in human history, and the impact it still has on the world today. You might think you know the basics: colonies, and the British flag in every corner of the globe. But there's so much more to the story than just that. Stick with me, because this isn't your typical history lesson. We're going to explore the rise, the glory, and the eventual collapse of the British Empire, and why it matters to us in the 21st century. So, how did a small island, with a population barely over 1 million people, end up controlling a quarter of the world? That's the question we need to answer. But it's not as simple as just saying they were better at fighting wars or had better technology. The British Empire didn't start with a grand plan to conquer the world. It started with a few small, profitable colonies and a lot of luck. In the 1500s, England was struggling. They were late to the party when it came to overseas exploration, compared to Spain or Portugal. But they had one thing going for them: they were determined. The first big breakthrough came with piracy. Piracy. British pirates like Sir Francis Drake began plundering Spanish treasure ships, which gave England a foothold in the Americas and access to valuable resources. This laid the foundation for what would become the British Empire. Now, let's jump ahead a bit. Fast forward to the 1600s, and Britain is beginning to establish its first permanent colonies. Jamestown, Virginia, the first English settlement in America, was founded in 1607. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Colonies were expensive to run, and the British didn't have the resources to take on the massive empires of Spain or Portugal. But what they lacked in size, they made up for in persistence. One of the biggest drivers of British expansion was trade. Britain didn't just want land, it wanted resources: sugar, tobacco, cotton, spices. And where did they get these? From the colonies they established all over the world. The British East India Company, founded in 1600, became one of the most powerful trading entities in history, controlling trade between India, China, and Britain. It wasn't just about goods. This company was essentially an arm of the British government, and it was only the beginning. As the British Empire grew, so did its navy. Britain's naval power was unmatched, and that allowed them to control sea routes and trade. By the 18th century, Britain had already established itself as a global power. But it wasn't until after the Napoleonic Wars, when Britain defeated France and secured dominance over Europe, that the real expansion began. Suddenly, Britain was everywhere: India, the Caribbean, Africa, and parts of the Middle East. If there was land to be conquered, the British were there. But here's where things get really interesting. You see, the British Empire wasn't just a colonial power. It was a force that changed entire societies. The empire brought incredible wealth to Britain, but it also brought suffering, exploitation, and violence to the people it ruled. The British Empire was built on the backs of enslaved people, resources stolen from colonies, and wars fought against indigenous populations. And while the British built roads, schools, and infrastructure in some places, they also destroyed cultures, exploited labor, and caused untold suffering. Take India, for example. For almost 2 centuries, Britain controlled India, extracting immense wealth from its resources. But the people of India suffered famines, violence, and economic exploitation. And it wasn't just India. The British Empire stretched across Africa, where millions of people were taken as slaves, to the Caribbean, where sugar plantations were worked by enslaved Africans. The legacy of British imperialism is still felt in these regions today, in ways that are hard to ignore. So, how did it all come crashing down? By the mid-20th century, the world had changed. 2 world wars had drained Britain's resources, and the colonies were growing more resistant to British rule. India gained independence in 1947, and soon after, other colonies followed suit. The British Empire collapsed, but its legacy remained. Today, the British Empire might be gone, but its impact is everywhere. The English language, British legal systems, and even cultural influences are felt around the world. And while the British Empire's history is complex, full of glory and shame. It's a chapter in history that continues to affect global politics and society today. If you want to learn more about how the British Empire shaped the modern world, hit that subscribe button and dive deeper into history with us.